Okay, hello everyone. Good evening. I'm Sofia Freudenstein, ASBI Maharat intern, and welcome to our Parsha class where we try to look at the Parsha every week through the lens of the Gemara, seeing how the Gemara takes a pasuk or an idea from our Parsha, maybe sometimes out of context, and maybe seeing from that concept in the Talmud a whole new way to think about our Parsha. So we've been really chugging through. We've seen lots of really interesting ways to use the Gemara. I will say this one, this week, I think is like a little bit more unusual. There's a lot more like Talmudic back and forth. So for those of you who either are familiar with Talmud before, you'll be seeing like some typical kind of Talmud logic debates. If it's your first time seeing things like this, it'll be like a really great exposure to thinking about what Gemara logic's all about. So hopefully the benefit of this kind of class is that we're only doing one section of Gemara and we're going to go in depth. So if it's a little bit out of your comfort zone, it's a great way to kind of like dip your toes into that experience. So without further ado, I will put the link in the chat. Okay, good. And I will share my screen. Okay. Okay, good. Everyone can see, hopefully. Good. Okay, screen sharing. So this is a really interesting Parsha. It shifts in narrative. Like so far, we've been seeing a lot of stories. Right? Like we've been seeing all the way in Bereshit, seeing the stories of Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. We've been seeing Bnei Israel getting out of Egypt. Last week we had the giving of the 10 Commandments. So now we're starting to get a little bit more law. And now, like, boom, I feel like it's like a kind of whiplash whenever I experience it. Parshat Mishpatim is the beginning of the Torah being a code of law. Like that's where we start getting all of these mitzvot. I'll probably be talking about this in my drasha this week at ASBI, but as a quick little sneak peek, the Sefer HaChinuch, which is a medieval book that counts the different mitzvot, right? There's this idea that there's 613 mitzvot in the Torah, and everyone agrees on the final count, but then there's a big debate about like what exactly is one mitzvah, right? Some people might see, some commentators think like belief in God is a mitzvah. Some people don't think from the 10 Commandments it's super clear because there's no like thou shalt believe, it's just a statement. So it becomes like this funny kind of exercise for rabbis, medieval rabbis, especially to like figure out which each mitzvah is the 613. But what you can see in the Sefer HaChinuch, which is one of the first books to count the 613, is that there's barely any mitzvot counted, right? Because there weren't so many commandments given before Har Sinai. But then, boom, by the end of this week's Parsha, we've knocked 91 out of the park, 91 out of 613. And so we can see that like just in one Parsha in about 3 chapters, there's so many different halachic ideas discussed that it's a real contrast to what we've seen before. So that's not where I want us to start off today. Chapter 21 up until 23 is all these laws. It ranges from how do you treat slaves, like conjugal rights between a husband and wife. There's even discussion of sorcery, lots of crazy fun things. Could have been a lot of fun to talk about, but we're going to jump to the end of the story because I think it portrays, remember all this is happening on Har Sinai. And so I think it portrays like an interesting idea of what Har Sinai is. Like for me, I have the image of Har Sinai that we have from last week's Parsha of all of us being there, being ready to receive the Torah. And I think that the way that chapter 24 talks about it, kind of like in this verse, like at the end of that whole experience, or maybe before, it's a little unclear timeline-wise when this is happening. I think it portrays a totally different way of thinking about what exactly Matan Torah at Har Sinai was like. So let's do that. Let's start off with that. Okay, I'm going to read in the Hebrew and translate. Ve'el Moshe Amar, Alei el Adonai Atab Aharon Nadav Avihu B'shivim Miziknei Yisrael B'shtachavita Mirachok. So God says to Moshe, go up to God, which is interesting, right? Like God's everywhere, but it seems to be that God is like where God needs to be reached in this moment is at the top of the mountain. You and Aaron, Nadav and Avihu, who are Aaron's sons, and the 70 elders. Remember, like last week we were talking about Yitro and appointing of different elders. So maybe this is like part of the structure that Yitro had set up. Now there's 70 elders. Go to the top of the mountain and bow from afar. It's time to honor God. Interesting, could be a whole shir in itself. Moshe actually is the one who goes up, and not all those other people, even though they were listed. And the people definitely do not go up with him. Okay. ויבוא משה ויספר לעם את כל דברי אדוני ואת כל המשפטים, ויען כל העם כל אחד ויאמרו כל הדברים אשר דיבר אדוני נעשה. So Moshe goes and from the mountain, right, to receive the Torah, which is what we read last week's Parsha. And then he tells all of the nation everything that Moshe heard up there, all the different Mishpatim, all the different rules, ordinances that we had learned from previous chapters, right? Like I just said, sorcery, slaves, all those things. Tells them all about them. And then the whole nation answers in one voice in the singular, kind of similar to last week, how we saw the nation acting in the singular, even though the nation is multiple people. And then they say, all the things that God said, we will do. Great, willingly taken on. Okay. ויכתוב משה את כל דברי אדוני, וישכים בבוקר, ויבן מזבח תחת ההר, ו12 מצבה ל12 שבטי ישראל. Great, so Moshe wrote all of it down. Thanks, Moshe, being the note taker. And then he wakes up in the morning and he builds an altar under the mountain, and there's like 12 different, pillars. I was wondering how they translate matzeva. Pillars, it represent the 12 tribes of Israel. Then they send the young people of Israel, so like the teenagers, the young boys, they go, and then on those different pillars, they sacrifice offerings, burnt offerings, and other kinds of offerings, shlamim, which were peace offerings, but the idea is that actually the olots, you all went to God, they burnt completely, while those ones we share as a community, we also get to eat, and they gave them all to God. I will say, to give us a quick little preview, this is the pasuk that's going to cause us like the most amount of trouble in our Gemara, so I'll highlight it for us in advance so you can go back to it. Okay. ויקח משה חצי הדם, וישם בעגנות, וחצי הדם זרק על המזבח. Moshe took some of the blood from those sacrifices, put it in basins, and the other part of the blood he dashed across the altar. I find it fascinating, sacrifices. I'm sure when we get to Vayikra, one book from now, we'll like do a lot more thinking about what sacrifices are. Even today, we'll use that opportunity to think like what exactly is going on here. This feels kind of gross, but like I feel like for me, when I think about sacrifices, maybe there's a moral question, like what does it mean to, I don't know, kill an animal for the sake of worshiping God? But here it's like just kind of gross to me, like lots of blood everywhere, but okay. ויקח ספר הברית ויקרא באוזני העם ויאמרו כל אשר דיבר אדוני נעשה ונשמע. So Moshe takes the book that he just wrote of the covenant, reads it in front of all of Israel, because they couldn't go up to the mountain and hear it themselves, and they say everything that God commands of us we will do and we will listen. This becomes a really important idea within like the philosophy or Jewish thought, philosophy of Judaism or Jewish thought, because it's kind of counterintuitive to say that we're going to do and then we will listen, right? Like we're taking on something before we fully understand what it is, but that's also an interesting educational model, right? Like lots of times children start doing things, or we tell them to do things where they understand what's going on, and that's just kind of how it is. So this becomes an interesting paradigm for faith. And then ויקח משה את הדם ויזרוק על העם ויאמר הנה דם הברית אשר כרת אדוני עמכם על כל הדברים האלה. Okay, not only does the blood go on those basins and on those pillars, but they even throws it on the nation, kind of gross. He says this is the blood of the covenant that God has established with you based off of all of these statements, all of these words that you now just took on. Now it goes on for much longer. If you're interested, I recommend checking out the rest of the chapter, because there's some even stranger things there that involve like seeing God and eating in front of God, lots of odd things that I don't think we usually associate with a religion like Judaism, but it's there in our text. If you ever want to talk about it with me, feel free to send me an email. But I wanted to capture this one because we're going to focus on this pasuk in the Gemara, but I just wanted to portray, I guess, an image of what it might have looked like at Har Sinai that I'm not used to thinking about. Usually I'm thinking of everyone being like super scared and trembling, and Moshe goes up and there's fire and the sound of a shofar, and this is something different. This is like there are sacrifices, a little bit more communal participation, a little bit more taking things on willingly. So I'm curious, before we move on to the Gemara sources, what your reactions might be. Was this how you were taught to think about what Matan Torah was like? Is there anything surprising to you? The usage of sacrifices? Anyone want to share before we move on to the Gemara? Barry, you want to start us off? And then if anyone wants to share, feel free to raise your hand.
I want to start off with a source question. very
Sure.
first pasuk up on the top talked about God saying to Moshe, "Come up to God."
Yeah.
With
I would
Yud
tell
K
it.
Vav K,
Yeah.
and so God is apparently, with my layperson English translational predominance in my study, looking at seeing the name of God in the particular name, and in the third person, and I'm thinking, and correct me if I'm wrong, so I guess I'm saying this is how I'm thinking. Please feedback to me how you think about it. And when I say you, I mean the whole class. Yud K Vav K is the aspect of God. So I'm seeing God, who I have come to see not only throughout Torah, throughout my life, as this multi-dimensional, multifaceted entity. Of course, defying human characteristic, but for my description being like the Torah speaks to us in language we can understand, that's the only way I can speak, is hopefully language we understand. That is, God is isolating that aspect of God for Moshe to come up to, and Aaron and Nadav and Avihu and all that, to whatever point they have to can approach, but then stop far off and bow at that point. But it's an aspect. So the source that we are getting these Mishpat, the source that we're getting this portion of Torah is from Yud K Vav K, and there are other aspects that are part of God, but maybe not part of the source of this aspect, the relationship between us and God. So I'm looking at the source, what part of God we're talking to. Is Yud K Vav K just a part of God? And if so, is that what I'm seeing? What do you think?
Yeah. I think that's a really good point. So, for those of you who might need to be able to caught up, the Kuzari, I think, is the first person to say this, or Yehuda Levi, in the 1200s. Well, kind of. There's this idea that there are like two different main names of God. There's Elohim and Adonai, and both of those mean God, but they kind of represent different relationships, different attributes of what God is. In Midrash, actually, earlier than the Kuzari, there's a discussion that Elohim means like a midat hadin, a kind of judgment way of thinking about God. But then this term for God is more rachamim, is more loving, more kind, more graceful, more grace oriented. And so here to see then, and so the Kuzari then extends that to Elohim is the name of God for all nations of the world, but then Adonai is like the personal, intimate kind of name that God gives Bnei Israel to call God. So it's interesting here to say to focus or almost meditate on this name of God, the more personal, more intimate one, right when they're becoming God's people, I think is an interesting distinction here. Also within the Kabbalistic mystical world, like meditating on the names of God was a very serious practice. So like maybe some of the texts here seem to be like fruitful ground for maybe where they got that from. So thank you.
To extend conspicuously missing from what you kindly told us, which was illuminating, was the term El Shaddai. So is there not another aspect to it?
Yeah, there's lots of names of God overall. So El Shaddai is one. I mean, Shekhinah is also like the feminine aspect, but Elohim and Adonai are probably the most prominent ones. So that's why often Midrash and also Rabbi Yehuda Levi like focused on those two. But yes, God has lots of names, even names that we're not allowed to pronounce out loud. So yeah. Anyone else want to share anything before we move on? Okay, let's get to the Gemara. This should be interesting.
One quick.
Yeah, sure, Barry. Quickly.
Back before we left Egypt, we already experienced the sacrificing of the Paschal Lamb. So the concept of sacrificing is, I think, no longer brand new. Maybe be extended to us in one place at one time, as opposed to wherever we were dispersed in the land of Goshen prior to assembling and Ramses and then going on from there. So we're not brand new to the concept of sacrificing, but I think we're becoming acquainted with the efficacy and the purpose of sacrificing into what our future or our current covenant to be extended for the future is going to be, what the deal is between us.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Even if we go all the way back to Bereshit, the first sacrifice, this is not the first sacrifice here. The first sacrifice is all the way back with Cain and Hevel, Cain and Abel. Also the way that Noah kind of like appeases God after the flood, or at least thanks God, there's a sacrifice. So it was already somewhat part of our lexicon, or the way that we interacted with God. But this is the first time there's like the sprinkling and also the representation of the 12 tribes. So maybe it's right. It's the beginning, I think, of us starting to see it as relational to God in a covenant sense. And for us, it seems very foreign, obviously, because that's not really how we, it's not the same as picking up a siddur and praying. But in ancient Near East, this was how they did it. And I think that one can wonder, so what other meaning is there? And that's hopefully what our Gemara is going to illuminate for us today. So that's a perfect segue. Okay. So the background that we need is a Mishnah first. Often the way Gemara works, right, is that Gemara is commentating on the Mishnah. The Mishnah was codified by Rabbi Yehuda Nasi in 220 CE. It was oral, but then there was a need to write it down because of all the Jewish persecution that was happening and the fear that we'd be forgetting everything that we were taught. And so this Mishnah and then the Gemara is from Masechet Chagiga. I'm trying to think if we've done Chagiga in this class. I think we might have not. This might be our first time. Masechet Chagiga is a tractate in the overall order Seder Moed, which is all the different tractates about holidays. And so usually they're named after specific holidays, Pesachim for Pesach, Megillah for Purim, lots of things like that. But then Chagiga is specifically about sacrifice that was given on holidays, the Korban Chagiga. Chagiga is connected to the word Chag, which is holiday in Hebrew. And the idea was that for the three main holidays, which were at the time Pesach, Shavuot, and Sukkot, that's when you would appear in front of the temple. And the way that you showed that you had to appear in front of the temple is you would give the Korban Chagiga. You would give, that would be one part. There would also be the Olat Riyah, which we'll see as well, which was the burnt sacrifice of seeing, because the idea is that you had to show yourself to be seen in front of God. But the Chagiga was like kind of what made it a party. And as much as, killing animals is not so appealing to us, at a time where we just said ancient Near Eastern context, but also where like the way that they celebrated was having a lamb roast and all sharing it together. Like that was how they celebrated. And the Korban Chagiga is what you did. You ate that as a group. So the way you would celebrate and be excited about God and the holiday was eating that Korban. So now we're going to have a discussion based off of these Mishnayot about specifically the Korban Chagiga that we were just talking about and the Olat Riyah. I'll even write in the chat so it's a little bit clearer to focus on the different Korbanot. So in English, how we call it burnt offering, which is the Olat Riyah, based off of the Hebrew Riyah. That's the first kind of sacrifice we're talking about. Okay. And the second one is the festival peace offering, or the Shalmei Chagiga. So you can keep track that those are the two different ones. And so a burnt offering means that it went totally to God. It gets totally burnt. But the festival element means that we get to eat it also. And so now we're going to have a discussion of debate about which one should get more money allocated to it. And we're going to see that it's actually this larger, deeper conversation about what exactly does celebrating mean. And we're going to be using our verses from the Parsha to help us understand it better. So keep track of the two types as we read this Mishnah. Okay. Beit Shammai says, the burnt offering of appearance, that's the Olat Riyah, that's number one, brought on a pilgrim festival must be worth at least 2 silver coins, and the festival peace offering must be worth at least 1 silver coin. And Beit Hillel says the opposite. The burnt offering of appearance must be worth at least 1 silver coin, and the festival peace offering should be worth 2 silver coins. So that's like, it might seem like a little bit scary first with the numbers, but what basically is being said is that Beit Shammai, and I will write this out for us also so we can keep track, says that Korban 1 should get more money. So I'll put a little plus sign. And then the second korban should get less. Beit Hillel says the first one should get less. And the second one should get more. And we're going to figure out, and the Gemara is going to be about why that's the case. So it's Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai are often debating each other. We're going to see at the end of the class, like what maybe the significance is of them having this debate. But it seems here it could be like a seemingly arbitrary discussion or fight. Like it seems to be suggesting that one korban is more important than the other, that you have to allocate more money towards it. But the question is, why does that matter? And that's what we're going to see. Any clarification questions before we dive in? Does it seem somewhat clear for us to move on? You can always ask during also, not a problem.
Were those two houses contemporaries?
Beit Hillel, Beit Shammai?
Yes.
I think that'd be like a fun thought exercise, but they are not currently around today. There's a really amazing piece in the
I met with
website.
each other at that time. Yeah.
Oh, at the time, yes, they were contemporaries of each other. Yes, I thought you meant contemporary today. I was like, that'd be
No,
cool if they were
sorry.
still around. Yes, they were around at the same time. They were chavruto with each other, which is very nice that they could disagree that way. Okay, let's get to it. So, the sages taught in a Braita. This is what we saw in the Mishnah. Beit Shammai says the burnt offering of parents must be worth 2 silver coins, and the festival peace offering need be worth only 1 silver coin. Okay, that's basically reiterating why. But the question is, why does Beit Shammai think that korban number 1 should get more and not korban number 2? The reason the burnt offering must be worth more is that the burnt offering of appearance goes up entirely to God, which is not so with regard to the festival peace offering, as parts of a peace offering are eaten by its owner, while other portions are consumed by the priest. Okay, so this is basically what we were saying, that the first korban is the one that goes totally to God. It gets totally burnt. No one gets to eat from it. And Beit Shammai thinks, well, therefore, if God is the only one eating it, it's more important. So that's the one that should get more money. Okay, and another source. And furthermore, another reason for this is that we find with regard to the festival of assembly, i.e. Shavuot, that's what they called it, the Chag HaAtzeret at the time, that the verse includes more burnt offerings than peace offerings. The sacrificial requirement consists of 1 bull, 2 rams, and 7 sheep as burnt offerings, but only 2 sheep for peace offerings. Okay, so another source, they have a source about Shavuot, where there's a list of all the korbanot, and when they say, here are the ones you need to bring for the Olat Riyah, the burnt offering, and then the ones for the Shalmei Chagiga that are the peace offering, there's more for that one in that case, so that means it's more important. Okay, and now we're going to have the opposite now from Beit Hillel. And Beit Hillel says the burnt offering of appearance must be worth 1 silver mea, and the silver peace offering must be worth 2 silver coins. So that was the inverse. The reason for this difference is that the festival peace offering existed before the speech of God, i.e. before the giving of Torah at Mount Sinai, which is not so with regard to the mitzvah of appearance. So this is interesting. The reason here for why would the Shalmei Chagiga korban number 2 be more important is that it existed before Har Sinai. That's like a very strange statement, but based off of this understanding, it seems that Beit Hillel thinks that like within the timeline of when certain mitzvot were given, that the commandment for that korban existed before Har Sinai, which kind of suggests that's more important. Like you didn't even need revelations to know about it. Okay, that's fascinating. What does that mean about like how Torah was revealed over time? The medieval commentators have a heyday with this because that really challenges like what does it mean to get Torah from Mount Sinai? What do we know before? We've discussed the idea of Noahide law in this class before, where like there seems to be some rules that were known even from after the flood, but not all. Or I think we also explored Gid Hanasheh here, right? The sciatic nerve and not eating the sciatic nerve. That was a law that was given before Har Sinai, but okay. Interesting that was his reason. That's Beit Hillel's reasoning. And furthermore, another reason is that we find with regard to the offering of the princes during the dedication of the tabernacle, the verse includes more peace offerings than burnt offerings. Each prince bought 1 cow, a ram, and a sheep as burnt offerings, but 2 cows, 2 rams, 5 goats, and 5 sheep as peace offerings. Okay, so basically what Beit Hillel says, similar to the discussion of Shavuot from Beit Shammai, is that there's another time where another korban is given. This is specifically the ones that the princes gave, and there, the Chagiga source, korban number 2, was more than the other one. So in case that's a little unclear, a little convoluted, this is what the Gemara does often, where the Gemara sees a debate between 2 different thinkers or 2 different rabbis and thinks there has to be a reason for why they have the disagreement. And they also probably have to be in dialogue with each other, right? Like they're both saying really valid arguments. So the question is, why would one override the other? So what the Gemara tries to do is like unravel post facto. How could they have different opinions? It must be that they're focusing on different data to figure out what the actual reasons are, and that's why they come to different conclusions. So that's what we're doing here. So the quick summary is, why does Beit Shammai think that the Olatria, the burnt offering, is more important? It goes only to God and not to us. And in Shavuot, there's more of that than the second Korban there. And then now for Beit Hillel, the reasoning for why the festival peace offering gets more is because it existed before Har Sinai, which suggests the kind of importance. And also another time where there was another list of Korbanot that got more credit than the Olaria. Okay, let's continue. I promise that if you're feeling a little confused, to hold on tight, because we're gonna tie it all up. And if you're following, that's great. And if it's difficult, it is objectively very difficult. So kudos to sticking with it. Okay. The Gemara asks, and Beit Hillel, what is the reason that they do not say in accordance with the opinion of Beit Shammai? Kind of like we were just saying before. We think that Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai are both giving valid reasons. So why isn't Beit Hillel saying what Beit Shammai said? Beit Hillel will respond to both claims of Beit Shammai. With regard to what you said, that the burnt offering of appearance is superior because it goes up entirely to God, on the contrary, the festival peace offering is superior as has two consumptions, by God on the altar and by people. So Beit Hillel says, okay, Beit Shammai, it's great that you think that that korban is more important because it goes totally to God. But what about if my korban went to God and the people, which is the Shalmei Chagiga? That makes it way more important. And with regard to that, which you said, that we derive the halakha from the festival of assembly, Shavuot, one could argue that instead the one should derive the halachot of the offering from an individual form, from another offering of an individual, i.e. the princes, and one does not derive the halachot of the offering of an individual from the communal offering of Shavuot. Basically, what Beit Hillel is doing here is kind of saying that it's a category mistake to compare Shavuot korbanot to these korbanot. He says, like, one is for the individual, right? Like, if I am an ancient Israelite trying to go to God and show myself for the holiday, that's me and my family going. While the princes, it was like the whole tribe. So you can't compare a community sacrifice with a personal sacrifice. So therefore, you can't learn anything from the sacrifice of Shavuot. So we got to chuck it out of the bin. And that's how the Gemara usually works. Like, they're able, by doing this unraveling, they're showing why Beit Hillel is not listening to Beit Shammai. They're providing counter arguments post facto. Okay. Great. So that was that one. But now the question is, why doesn't Beit Shammai say in accordance with Beit Hillel? Beit Shammai would respond to the arguments of Beit Hillel. With regard to that which you said, that the festival peace offering is superior, as it existed before the speech of God, the burnt offering appearance also existed before the speech. According to the opinion of Beit Shammai, the Jewish people sacrificed burnt offerings at Mount Sinai before the giving of the Torah. So Beit Shammai says, you think, Beit Hillel, that the Shalmei Chagiga is so important because it existed before Har Sinai, and therefore it seems to like intuitively been known, and therefore is more important. So was our korban. You can't use that as a good argument. Okay. And with regard to that which you said, that one derives the halachot of these offerings from the offerings of the princes, one could argue that one derives the halachot of a matter that is performed in all generations, i.e. the value of different festival offerings, from another matter that is performed in all generations, i.e. the offerings of Ron Shavuot. However, one does not derive the halachot of a matter that is performed in all generations from a matter that is not performed in all generations, as the offering of the princes was a specific mitzvah for the tabernacle in the wilderness. So here, Beit Shammai does a totally different kind of category mistake. He says, Beit Hillel, you can't learn princes' korbanot to our korbanot because that one was only relevant for that time. The princes only existed in the desert. And our situation of going to the temple and giving every single year, I mean, this was obviously in a time where we're imagining going to the temple 3 times a year, so that's not true anymore. But they were thinking about it as something that was permanent, not just existing in the temple, in the desert. You can't learn them. One was temporary, one is permanent. You can't learn one rule from the other. So even though in different ways, Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai are doing the same thing, they're showing why the first argument is not necessarily the case. And then they're showing how you can't apply one rule from the other because it'd be a kind of category mistake. They're not the same. Okay, so that's what's happening there. But now here's where our pasuk comes in altogether, and then hopefully we'll begin thinking, what are we supposed to do with all of this Gemara logic? What is this teaching us about the nature of korbanot? Okay. So now the Gemara asks, and according to the opinion of Beit Hillel, what is different about the festival peace offering that existed before the speech of God, as it's written, and they sacrificed peace offerings of bills to the Lord. The burnt offering of appearance is also mentioned, as it isn't it written in the same verse, and they sacrifice burnt offerings. So now here, this is where highlighting that pasuk before verse 5 is important. And I made a little chart for us here in some colors so that we can keep track. Basically, what they're looking at is this pasuk, which was verse 5, where it says that we sent the young people of Bnei Israel to go sacrifice all these kinds of sacrifices. And what it says is Vayalu olot ve'yizbechu zvachim shlamim l'Hashem parim. So what Beit Hillel is focusing on, this is what's in the blue, if you're able to see that, ve'yizbechu zvachim shlamim. Beit Hillel says, see shlamim there, that's like shalmei chagiga, the peace offerings of chagiga. This verse teaches us that therefore they were able to sacrifice those things before Har Sinai. If you remember, we were talking about like the confusion of the timeline. Like this chapter appears at the end of the Parsha, but it's also like a little weird because we know that Moshe goes up, and actually later on we're going to see when he comes down, he's going to see the golden calf. That's in a few Parshiot from now, and it'll be pretty messy. But here we see that like they heard some stuff and they said it was all great, and then they made sacrifices. So Beit Hillel is saying that actually happened before Har Sinai, and that's how we know that then this idea of the shlamim, the peace offerings, existed beforehand. But then Beit Shammai, this is what the Gemara says is very funny. It says, wait a minute, Beit Hillel, you got to read the rest of the verse. It's not just zvachim shlamim. The first verse says vaya'alu alot. They offered burnt offerings. So Beit Shammai could say that also existed before Har Sinai. So they're looking at the verse, and we can jump all the way back up to the English that we have it here. And they're reading, they burnt offerings as a different kind of offering as this one, the peace offering, and the offering of well-being. And they're saying that this is how Beit Hillel learns it existed before Har Sinai, and therefore is more important. But Beit Shammai could do the same thing because that's a burnt offering. So this looks like Korban number 2, but this one looks like Korban number 1. And this is happening before Har Sinai. So what are we supposed to do? And the way that they resolve the conflict is, and this is also how Gemara logic will do it, Beit Hillel has to somehow explain that the burnt offerings aren't the burnt offerings that Beit Shammai is talking about. Okay. And that's what we have here. The Gemara responds, Beit Hillel holds that the burnt offering that the Jewish people sacrificed in the desert Mount Sinai was the daily burnt offering, which is a communal offering, as there's no individual burnt offerings for the giving of the Torah. And Beit Shammai hold that the burnt offering that the Jewish people sacrificed in the desert at Mount Sinai was a burnt offering of appearance, which is an individual offering. So Beit Hillel says, great, it was a different burnt offering. It wasn't the burnt offering that we give on holidays. It was the burnt offering that we give every day, because there used to be sacrifices every single day. And so there was the Olat Tamid, which was, Tamid means consistent. So the idea is that they gave this sacrifice every single day. And that's what they were talking about, not yours, Beit Shammai. So that's what I have at the end of the chart here. That Beit Hillel, what they do with the Vaya'alu alot, those burnt offerings, which is in yellow, they explain it's a totally different Korban, problem solved. So for me, what I find somewhat challenging about these Gemaras is like kind of hard to follow the train of thought. I remember when I did this for the first time, I had to like chart it all out and kind of imagine it like branching out. But it's almost like a kind of puzzle. The way that the Gemara is dealing with this is they're saying we need these ideas to fit together, and Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel are smart people, so they need to have different reasons for why they're coming up with different things. And when Beit Shammai has one reason, Beit Hillel has to contend with it. And like the way they'll do it is say, oh, we're not talking about the same thing, which is what's happening here. But they do it based off of this like one pasuk that if you read it in the pshat, in the literal meaning from above, it kind of feels like they were just talking about different korbanot, and then all of a sudden the Gemara like turns into this whole discussion of minutia, which is like sometimes difficult because sometimes it feels like the Gemara is making mountains out of molehills, like if you just read the regular text. But I want to guess think about it as maybe not just, sometimes there's a beauty in creating some mountains and seeing like a sense of omni-significance of like potential different meanings all in one space. And I think that even though the back and forth, the pilpul would be the way to describe it in Hebrew, of the Gemara can feel a little bit difficult, they seem to be really struggling with kind of what is the significance of these korbanot. And as much as might be hard to follow along, that's really what they're debating. And that's kind of what I want to end, like wrap up with, is show that actually what they're debating might seem kind of arbitrary and just like, why are they doing this weird logic puzzle? There's actually like a greater debate about how Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai see the worlds altogether. So before we move on to that, does anyone want to ask any questions, share any comments, any frustrations with what we've done so far? Okay, Barry, start us off. And really, anyone is welcome to share.
Please. And mine is confusion. And I studied part of Talmud Daf Yomi with Rabbi Wilkenfeld at the table after Shachrit, back pre-COVID when we were meeting in class in the Beit Midrash. And we studied about the sacrifices on the ark, and on the altar, and how the Kohanim would go up the ramp, and when they were sacrificing, they would sprinkle blood 2 by 2, so to make 4. So there were 2 sprinklings that hit 2 sides each of the altar, making 4 sprinklings, if you will, with 2 gestures. So all this was fascinating. But what I'm seeing here, and it's confusing because it's been a while since I've studied that tractate. But here we're seeing, what confuses me is Moshe knew he was supposed to sprinkle blood on the altar, and knew he was supposed to sprinkle blood on people. So dash, if you will. But what's not delineated, at least not here, and maybe it's somewhere else, or maybe it's too detailed for us at this point, is when you're sacrificing these animals, you may or may not be mixing blood. It's unclear here, of one animal to another, but some of that blood of each of those animals goes against the altar, and the remainder at this point gets dashed on the people. Later on in Ezumam Shalvachim, the Tefillah, that they accumulated blood that wasn't used, and they tossed it in the western base of the outer altar. And if they didn't do that, that didn't harm any of the sacrificing. But the sprinkling of the blood had to be detailed. So now here comes my punchline. Knowing that there's these different possibilities going on, we don't know really what's being talked about here. And Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai aren't referring at all to how this sprinkling is going on, and how that might differentiate the sacrifices, and how the sacrifices of these animals, 2 of this, 1 of that, 7 of this, made a difference. Hopefully that comes later, and it comes Talmudic and whatnot. But it's all confusing, and yet it's all part of the atonement and the religion process.
Totally.
So it's completely confusing to me at this point, and it's bringing up a lot of doubtful questions that I had back when.
It's definitely confusing. I think something that kind of makes me feel more grounded in the confusion is an idea that I read in Chaim Seiman's book Halacha. That's what it's called, Halacha. And basically it's like an academic analysis of what exactly is happening in the Talmud. And what he points out is very interesting, is that, like, we're talking about Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai, who did live during the time of the temple, but they're not talking. Like, actually, if you read the narrative, these are the Amoraic rabbis trying to figure out almost 500 years later in Babylon what maybe Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai could have been saying to each other. And when you think about it that way, the way that Chaim Seiman talks about it is, it's almost like this, like, very sad kind of like mourning or grief. Like, they've never seen the temple before, these Amoraic rabbis. They're almost like trying to construct something from nothing. They heard about the temple, they understand the significance of it within a Jewish context, and they've been in exile for over 500 years now, and all they have are these statements of what rabbis said about what the korbanot were. And then the rabbis kind of like going back and forth, like playing this weird ping pong, is almost like them kind of like trying to create a world that never was for them. That this was their way of, like, they just wish they could give it. They just like want to go and give their burnt offerings and eating their peace offerings with their friends. Like, that's what they want. And so, but they can't, because they're in exile. And so them creating these intellectual like castles, I think that's like the term they uses, that are like so odd, and you read them, you're like, what is going on? But when you take a step back and think psychologically, maybe where it's coming from, they really want to understand so well, because this is all they have. This is their only connection to the temple. For me, that makes me feel much better when it's super confusing, because I go, oh, okay, that's like more complicated than, not, I mean, it's confusing, but it's like there's an emotional complicatedness to it, that when you realize what they're debating, like, there was no practical application for this for them whatsoever. And so do you think this is their way of comforting themselves? I think that actually is like it's a little sad, but I think it's quite beautiful. It's like an interesting statement about what we do with grief. And we try and create this world that was. So
I think of it as gross but thrilling for me. It's
yeah,
gross but it's thrilling. Oh my gosh.
yeah. I mean, it's almost like a kind of nostalgia for like something we never were at. So yeah, thank you. Does anyone else want to share?
Thank you.
I actually have a question.
Yeah, hi.
Maybe there's something I'm not understanding here, but is there some significance to the order in which these responses happen? Like instead of like one response and answer and another response, they like set up their two different arguments and then sort of go from there?
Yeah, no, I think that's a great question. The Gemara is structured in like such an interesting way because on the one hand, it's oral tradition. So like you'd think that there's like a lack of structure because it's like just sayings, but they were trying to memorize it and then they wrote it down. So when you think about mnemonics that you create for yourself or like different tricks, like when you're studying for a test, that's how the Gemara is thinking. And so what I didn't provide here is that this sugya continues, this passage of Gemara continues. And what happens is Abaye, who's an Amoraic rabbi from Babylon in the 500s, he then starts taking all these different ideas of Tannaitic rabbis from 300 years before who have like plot themselves on the Beit Hillel, Beit Shammai debate. And so you need this as like a setup to understand where the different rabbis are going to go. I thought, this is complicated. I was like, that feels like a whole other level. I have it written out because I've taught it elsewhere. So like, if you're interested, I'm happy to show it to you, but it's set up this way so that we can better understand the argument that's about to come. So yeah, I do think though, in light of structure, usually we go with Beit Hillel over Beit Shammai, and we'll talk about that at the end of the class. And I think it's interesting they're like really focused on Beit Shammai first here. But usually the way I imagine it structure wise is that like they're trying to like knock each option out of the way and trying to get to like a place where we can like start on equal playing ground. That's kind of how I feel like what they're doing here. That like they're trying to knock down each assumption and like the same level so that you can kind of like be at equal playing grounds, Beit Hillel, Beit Shammai. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, that's really interesting. Thank you.
Yeah, there's an amazing book that I'm looking at in my room that's over there that you don't see called Reconstructing the Talmud by Joshua Culp. And it's a really great book that's in English and like talks a lot about the construction of like these Talmudic arguments. And if you're interested, I'm happy to send it to you by email.
I want to know the name. Can you send it?
Thank you.
Yeah, happy to follow up.
Please.
I usually put my email in the source sheet and I forgot, but I'll put it here in case
Okay, I'll ask you.
you would like it. Any other questions before we move on? Amazing. Okay. Let's get to the meaning making. This is what we're here for. We're done with this back and forth. Okay.
Really
we're talking about Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai. And we were talking about this idea of these sacrifices having different amounts of money allocated to them. Seemed like this weird debate back and forth. But I want to focus on the idea that was like kind of mentioned throughout, which is that Beit Shammai seems to think that more money should go to the sacrifice that goes fully to God, while Beit Hillel thinks the one that is communed with both God and humanity is the one that should get more money. And they want us to see some more like bigger philosophical debates between Hillel and Shammai and wonder how maybe those can help us understand that debate about the money allocation of the sacrifices better and maybe realize that what they're fighting about might seem arbitrary, but maybe there's actually a deeper resonance to them. So this is from Breshit Rabbah. This is a midrash on Breshit, all the way to this, like the beginning of the creation story. And this is what it says: Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel. Beit Shammai said that the heavens were created first, and after the earth was created. And Beit Hillel said the earth was created first, and afterwards the heavens. So they're having a debate. Bereshit bara Elohim et hashamayim ve'et haaretz. God created the world, sky, and then land. But does that actually have the order happen? Or maybe we're just listing it. Beit Shammai thinks heavens were created first, and then the earth, while Beit Hillel thinks the opposite. And we could think this seems like an arbitrary debate, but it also seems to be an implicit kind of question of what is more important, the heavens or the earth, being more of a metaphor of like the spiritual, the godly, the transcendent, versus the earthly, the more mundane. And Beit Hillel thinks that the mundane is what's more important, while Beit Shammai is focusing on the above. So that's the first preface. And here's one that I think like really kind of takes it home. The sages taught the following Breita. For 2.5 years, Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel disagreed, right? They were contemporaries, right? Like Barry's question. They were like real chavrutot. They say it would have been preferable. These say it would have been preferable had man not been created than to have been created. And those said it is preferable for man to have been created than had he not been created. Okay. Basically what they're debating here is that Beit Shammai says it would be better if humanity was not created altogether. While Beit Hillel says, no, it's pretty ideal that humanity was created. This might seem like a funny question because we were created. But the question is, was this something that was the ideal of what God wanted? Or is it kind of a more b'di'evet, a more kind of pragmatic situation? And it seems to me that what Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai are arguing about here is really this idea, I guess, of human worth, of we're automatically as human beings, we are flawed. And it seems like Beit Shammai has a huge problem with that. Beit Shammai thinks, wow, if we're going to be human beings and make mistakes in this world, then maybe it's better that we just aren't there altogether. Wouldn't it be better to not make those mistakes and to kind of have a clean slate? But Beit Hillel thinks, no, it's better for us to be created. I mean, it's like God created us, and there must be a reason why, even if it means that we might have some slip-ups on the way. And so I think that these debates that Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai are having, whether it be about the heavens or the earth, or what our role is in the world, are these discussions about what's more important. And then you think about the Korban discussion we had, right? That Beit Shammai thinks that the sacrifices that are all to God are more important, while Beit Hillel thinks that the ones that we share with God are more important, are really manifestations of these larger worldviews that they seem to have, where Beit Shammai seems to be kind of almost zealous, I would say, that like there's this like extreme black and whiteness to the way Beit Shammai thinks. Like, no, it's all about transcending. It's all about God. While Beit Hillel says, no. It's about a kind of partnership between us. We're communing together. We're eating together with God. It's not about just serving God. And that also suggests an elevation of us that Beit Shammai seems to not have by thinking that maybe the world would be better off if we weren't there. And I think that what's the most powerful is that, and this comes up later on in Tractate Eruvin, which is what I quoted here, is that there are all these amazing debates of Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai, but ultimately we pragmatically often go with Beit Hillel. And so we have, it's important to have the voice of Beit Shammai. It's good to remind ourselves that, like, it's good to try and transcend and push for what is right. But it's also good that we're here, and that the Talmud often chooses Beit Hillel over Beit Shammai. It seems to be kind of a statement of like, we like this idea of partnership better than the idea that it's God or nothing. And I think that that's a really interesting charge for us. We are descendants of Beit Hillel and the decisions of Beit Hillel as the Jewish people. And so to think that this is actually what we stand for, we go back to that whole crazy discussion back and forth about sacrifice and think that's actually what they were talking about, and that they were getting that from our verse that like really seemed to not be talking about that whatsoever. I think is really cool that it somehow turned into like a whole world unto itself about the discussion of what is our role in the divine partnership, and seeing that as the ideal and not just necessary evil. Almost, I mean, the way that I think often original sin in Christianity is talked about, there are obviously exceptions, but I think the way it's talked about in common culture is like humans being human and being flawed is like, it's bad. It's the downfall of society. We start off like at a low. Well, that's not necessarily clear in the Jewish context that we're starting off at a low. It's not great. We sinned. We gained mortality, but lots of other amazing things unfolded after the Garden of Eden. And I think that it's really powerful that then this is the tradition that we are charged with. So on that note, if anyone has any thoughts, questions, or comments, you're welcome to share our clarification questions, because there's a lot of complicated concepts. But hopefully now we can understand those sacrifices in a whole new light, see that they're actually these debates about kind of what it means to be people in the universe. And yeah, curious your thoughts. Barry, start us off.
Please, anybody jump in and I will yield the floor. But it seems to me that your indication, Sophia, was really brilliant, because it parallels the brilliance of another teacher, if you will, Rashi, that wrote,
Oh,
wrote,
wow, I'm honored.
wrote the, yeah, well, it's, well, you're a good student and you've learned well, Obi-Wan. You hit us, you hit a chord in me by bringing this up, which is the appropriateness of this here at this time is brilliant. And that is, it takes us whole back to the whole big picture and parts of it and how you see the big picture and the parts. And it suddenly occurs to me that I'm living in a world that I was born to. I wasn't consulted. I wasn't I was born into it for however many millennia there have been, or 5,700 years, or whatever you want to count. That the debate about God and creation is on the table, and it can underlie any question anywhere along the way, even something as, excuse the expression, mundane as sacrifices. You're killing animals, you're splashing blood. Where's the religion in this? Where is the spirituality? And yet it's there, and it's there profoundly. And so these guys create these kinds of impressions, and the parallelism it brings to my question, it strikes the chord in me about the question I read when Rashi was telling me in Breshit, as commentary to God's comment to his heavenly court, let us create man in our image. And all of a sudden, what does this let us? What is this team kind of, what is this consultation going on? There's a heavenly court. And Rashi's the first to admit, God doesn't need a heavenly court. God doesn't need anything or anyone except God. And yet, he teaches us, the generic he, excuse me, God teaches us proper behavior. And he does it throughout Breshit, throughout Shemot, and he's going throughout Bamidbar and Vayikra and Vari, and he's going to teach us forever that there's a proper action to be taken. And so God consults, and heavenly court feeds back. How profound, or how yes, the stamp of a yes entity, if you will. But I think that's what makes us the brilliant creation, flawed as we are, that God wants us to be his yes creation, but God wants us to be wanting to be the yes creation. The angels are already there in place automatically to serve, to do their part. We see that throughout Breshit most vividly. So, but we are here to do our part. And on one hand, you can say it is our part to be flawed and imperfect. God knew that from the beginning. He knew there was going to be mortality. He knew that this was all going to play out. But in the beginning, we didn't, and we still don't. We know that there's mortality, but we don't know how things are going to play out. Really, we just have faith that God will have this thing all work out, God's plan. But God wants us to want to be God's team, God's servants, and embrace the avodah and not toss off the yoke. And I'm not hearing this in Beit Shammai versus Beit Hillel, and yet I think it's underlying them. So I'm good with this whole thing. It's perpetual debate amongst us. And you were brilliant to bring it up now, and you were brilliant to bring it up with this, Sophia. Thank you.
Thank you. I think, well, aside from being compared to Rashi, I don't think I'll ever stop thinking of that one. But I think, and again, this is a nice preview for what I'll speak about on Shabbat. But something that I find kind of difficult about the beginning of these parshiot is we start just getting bogged down with all these laws. And that's, I mean, I'm in rabbinical school. I like halacha, like that's why I'm here. But sometimes it can feel like we've lost sight of the bigger picture. And then to remind myself to see that in this like very arbitrary, like seemingly arbitrary line about sacrifices, and sacrifices that like are the most obscure, distant from my religiosity today, that even they're talking about this like grand debate of what is the meaning of life is very helpful. And I think that maybe I'm naive, but I do think that that's what every single mitzvah has the opportunity to do. I think that it's our job, our calling as being divine partners in all of this, is seeing a mitzvah and looking at it and going, what is this teaching me about my place in the universe? And so some, and I don't want that to be an overwhelming question. I don't want, every single time you like, check your lettuce for bugs, or, like, okay, that would probably be exhausting. Like every single time you make a salad, you're like, what is the meaning of life? Okay, like maybe take a step back. But to think that that's actually what all of this is to do. And then also when there are halachot that are like very troubling, to think like, well, what is it actually trying to teach us about the world? And maybe it's not working anymore. Maybe that's when we need to start thinking this is like when we have to think about what does it look like to reevaluate this in our lives. I think that I have yet to find a mitzvah where that is not possible. Part of my like charge of being in rabbinical school is like looking everything that we encounter. I feel like there has to be kind of this larger existential meaning behind it. And it's a little exhausting, I guess, to think about that all the time, but I kind of think that's like what halacha is supposed to be. It's helping us realize our place in the world and how we should walk halicha, I guess, in it. And to think that even in the minutia, which we often do get bogged down by, that even that is somehow a manifestation of our purpose in the world, I find this very empowering. So thank you for letting me get on my soapbox there, Barry. It was a good jumping point to that.
It was well placed.
Thank you. Any other thoughts?
Yeah, bring them on, please. Come on, somebody.
Awesome. Well, I don't want to keep us over time. This was a little bit more complicated, this one. So I don't want to keep anyone because I know it's already 8:30 CST. But thank you so much for coming this evening, for like cracking your brain a little bit to get here. But hopefully, even with all the crazy Talmudic back and forth, we're able to kind of zoom out and see the deeper meaning behind it all. And yeah, thank you for spending your evening with me, and see you next week.
Sure. Take care, everybody. Sure.
Amazing. Have a good night.